Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again today. We've got a great fun chat planned, another bit of 1950s history, and actually we're going to precede that 1950s time as we are talking about this guest and with this guest rather, and Jackie and I will interject some of our interesting legacy that combines with our guest's legacy.
Greetings, everyone, and do take note in the upper corner of your screen of the book that spurred this fun chat. It's called While the Windmill Watched, a Slice of Rural America in the 1950s. And then at the bottom below, you'll see the website banner going around, down across, and that's www. While the Windmill Watched. So you can go there for all sorts of information about the book, the vendors, where the authors will be appearing, and all where you can purchase the book, and all previous fun chats. This is number 213. So you have days of watching and learning about 1950s history. So we shall start now. It's a small world is an idiom to which Janine and I can relate through hours of genealogical research. Our guest, Allyn Brosz, discovered that we are fourth cousins. Allyn was born in 1948 in St. Benedict's Hospital in Parkston, South Dakota, in the same area in which our paternal grandmother was born. He spent most of his childhood and teen years on the farm homesteaded by his great-grandfather, Allyn Brosz. Now, Allyn earned bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of South Dakota and another master's degree from the University of Oklahoma. Allyn studied in Germany for a year and Italy for a year. And he worked in the kibbutz. I'm sorry, I must have messed that one up. In Israel for a few months, and then obtained graduate degrees and taught political science at Virginia Tech, to name just a few of his educational adventures. He's an avid genealogical detective and is now retired from a civilian career as an analyst in the Department of Defense. Allyn has lived in Washington, D.C. since 1983. He's married and has two stepdaughters. So, Allyn, we welcome you to the 1950s Fun Chat.
Yes.
So today we're going to learn of some generalities of Germans from Russia in America, and then touch on some specifics. But we're going to go back many, many years and ask Allyn, why were Germans even living in Russia? And then what caused them to leave?
Well, thank you again for inviting me back here. This is a great opportunity to chat. And I always reflect on my German-Russian background, and I've spent many, many years fascinated by it. My grandmother used to call me a curious child. And so I have accumulated all these facts. But basically, our ancestors lived in the German states, specifically in Württemberg, as far back as I can trace, back to 1543, our first direct ancestor. And that makes him almost a contemporary of someone like Martin Luther. So they lived in Germany for about 250 years, but around 1800, all sorts of things were happening that made it less and less desirable to live there. So there were both push and pull factors that made them think about a new homeland. The push factors were things like Napoleon Bonaparte, who had come out of the French Revolution and had taken over and occupied large parts of what today is Western Germany. So the Brosz family was living in occupied territory, and as a result, the names of their young sons were now on the conscription rolls for Napoleon's army. At the same time, there were other factors like the introduction of a new songbook with more modern themes and hymns. And even today, we know that something like that can cause some diversions or dissensions in the church when that happens. And our ancestors were fairly pious, so they liked those old songs, they liked those old arrangements. At the same time, the area where they lived was incredibly densely populated. A middle class, fairly well-to-do farmer might own about 40 acres of land. And they were living in the Black Forest, so a lot of that land was timberland, not cropland. And many of our ancestors made their living by being lumberjacks, charcoal burners, shingle makers, and other trades associated with forestry. So at the same time, Russia had been at war with the Ottoman Empire. Today, that's known as Turkey, and had gained a number of pieces of territory which they wanted to populate with people. And so they had recruiters stationed in the German states, actively recruiting people to come to Russia. That was the pull factor. And so in about 1800, our ancestors made the decision that it was time to move, and they took off from the small villages where they lived. And they didn't go directly to Russia. They first went to Poland because Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Prussia had broken up and partitioned Poland completely out of existence. And Prussia was holding a piece of land called South Prussia. That's where the Broses first landed and pioneered for about 15 years. But then at the invitation of the Russian Tsar, they moved on into Russia to an area called Bessarabia, where they got a lot of privileges. They got almost as much land as an American homestead, in fact, a bit more, 162 acres. They got exemption from military service, allegedly for all time. They got freedom from taxes for a number of years until they were well established. They got agricultural tools. And so they began to build villages which over the course of the years blossomed and prospered. And that was basically a good time for them up until about 1871, when another czar took away a lot of those privileges. And that led them to start thinking about America.
All right.
Man, this is so interesting, Allyn. And I must admit that a number of years ago, it would not have piqued my curiosity like it does now. But I think just in the past years, since we have talked with you, since we have learned more, that we actually, at least for my benefit, had an ancestor. Our grandma Justina Pfeiffer her family was Germans from Russia, and that this interest in it for me has blossomed, and I'm just trying to soak it all in as fast as I can as you're talking. So go ahead, Jackie.
I was just going to say, but the Ukraine has been in the news, and so that is the area that these Germans from Russia were living. So maybe that brought it up too. Go ahead. One more thing, and then I'll go to the next thing. Okay. So, Allyn, do you happen to know the origin of the Germans from Russia that landed in South Dakota? Why did the first Germans from Russia go to that particular spot? And then after that, then so many more Germans from Russia came to that spot. Parks in South Dakota area in particular?
Yeah, well, a lot of that had to do with the fact that going way back to Germany, our ancestors were basically agricultural people. In Russia, they were certainly, for the most part, with the exception of a small group of tradespeople and a very few professionals and church people, most of them were agricultural people. So they were looking for land. That was the big draw that brought them to America. And of course, in 1862, the Homestead Act was passed, and that allowed them to claim 160 acres of land for a very nominal fee, $18 filing fee. And they had to live on it for 5 years and make improvements. And so that looked good to them. And I am really always impressed by a memoir that was written by a North Dakota woman, Nina Farley-Wishick. She was not herself a German from Russia, but she was an outstanding pioneer in McIntosh County, and she wrote a book, Along the Trails of Yesterday. And she's got a wonderful chapter in there called German Maids I Have Known. And she talks about talking with these young girls, and they related to her some of their life in Russia. And the phrase that I love is they talked about on summer evenings after the work was done, they would sit around and they would chat. And, you know, they would talk about America. In German, the phrase was, you know, dort naus ist Amerika. America's out there. And they were making thoughts about moving to America. So that was a big motivation. And so if you look at the line of settlement in the early 1870s, well, Iowa and Minnesota and Kansas and Missouri were pretty well settled up. There wasn't a lot of free land for homesteading available, but the Dakota frontier was beckoning them. And in 1873 to about 1885, the period in Dakota Territory was known as the period of the Dakota boom. And it was a time of expansion. The railroads were establishing routes into the territory, which made it easier for the immigrants to come in. And that was the primary impetus. You know, there were scouts that went out ahead of time and examined different states to determine what looked best. And I think one of the things that the Dakotas had going for them is that the landscape there looked a lot like the steppes of Russia. It was home to them. The weather, the climate conditions were perhaps a little bit harsher. Colder winters, hotter summers, but nevertheless, it was attractive to them, and it was something that they felt they could deal with. So I think that was a big draw. And of course, you know, once the first groups of people came in 1873 and got established and learned the ropes, so to speak, and knew what the process was for becoming a citizen and claiming land, there was correspondence back to the old country. And that was kind of the pull factor again. It was something we called chain migration. And when the Brosz family came, it was probably because my great-grandmother's sister and her husband and family had come over the year before. And they had settled in Yankton County, north of Yankton and southeast of where the Brosz family homesteaded. And that's where my great-grandparents overwintered for the first winter. They came in November, they stayed with that family, and then in the spring they went out to their homestead.
So I do want to know, though, do you happen to know why that piece, why Parkson, South Dakota area, why Yankton? Why did those first people come there? Do you happen to know?
Well, okay, so first of all, let me answer your question, why Yankton? Because in late 1872, early 1873, the railroad finally reached Yankton. That was sort of the end of the line for the railroad.
Okay.
And so, Yankton was the territorial capital for Dakota Territory at that time. And so they came there, and then they were looking around for land. And so there were Germans from Russia who had come a few years earlier, and like I said earlier, had learned the ropes, and they became what were called locators. Great-grandfather would go to the county courthouse, and he would meet up with one of these guys who spoke his language and had a horse and buggy, and they would look in the land book and see what land was available. It had all been surveyed and marked. And they would go out and look around, and they would see what land looked favorable. And my father always told me the way to identify the farms which were truly homestead farms were the farms that were located along the creeks, because they were looking for water. They wanted a water source. So, he found a piece of land which looked favorable to him and staked his claim on it.
When you had mentioned about homesteading, you had said that the people who applied for a claim and paid that filing fee had to make improvements. Were there certain restrictions as far as the kinds of improvements to be made on that land?
There were general things like, okay, first of all, you had to live on the land for 5 years. So that sort of implied that you had to build a dwelling. But unlike what some sources say, there was no stipulation about how big that dwelling had to be or what it had to look like. And so if you read the Laura Ingalls Wilder books about homesteading, you will know that when they were in the De Smet, South Dakota area, they had kind of basically a tar paper shack that they lived in. Our Germans from Russia were more practiced at that, and they would often build what were called sod houses or mud houses, which were habitable year around. But the interesting thing about that was that our German-Russian ancestors were very crafty or sly about how to get around those requirements. So like when my great-grandmother's sister became widowed and she was able to homestead in her own name, she found some land just a couple of miles from the Brosz homestead, and her son by that time was old enough to homestead. So they got claims next to each other, and they built one house right on the borderline with a door opening out in each direction.
Oh, smart.
And so, that neither of them had a house with four walls, so to speak. But they were living on the land, and they made it work.
So we're talking about Germans from Russia. What is the difference other than that the Germans from Russia went to Russia, farmed, and then moved back to or into this country? What's the difference from if you're a German or if you're a German from Russia?
Well, I don't think there really was a difference in except for the fact that, where did you come from? Well, the Germans, what we call the Reich Germans, came from the German Reich, from Germany, and the Germans from Russia came from Germany. And of course, the Norwegians came from Norway, the Swedes came from Sweden, et cetera, et cetera. So there were a lot of commonalities on the prairie. But of course, there were, some significant differences. They kind of tended to stick together, and the early churches were churches in their native language, whether that was German or Norwegian or Swedish or Czech or whatever. And some, of course, as we'll get into a little bit later, the foodways were somewhat different, and some of the customs were perhaps a little bit different.
Okay. Can we start talking about those foodways, because then we can really go through up into the 50s and really what the event that we're looking forward to attending next week.
Right.
Yeah, well, there were lots of good foodways, and I would say in overview of this entire conversation, I am reminded of a presentation that a good friend and colleague of mine from Saskatoon in Canada gave some years ago, and he called it, growing up German from Russia and not even knowing it. And what he meant by that was, we were so embedded in the culture and it was so much part of our everyday life that we didn't think about that as anything special when we were growing up. But there were some important things that were always part of our culture, and those foodways that were part of the culinary culture, if you will, were things that, again, to some extent, we brought from Russia. There were dishes that we know were cooked and prepared in Russia, and some of those were basic meat dishes. There were things, I will mention one in particular, which had a name that I think was borrowed either from the Ukrainians or perhaps from the Czechoslovakians. And we called it, as kids in the vernacular, we called it pigs in the blanket.
Oh, yes.
But it was also called halupsi. And it was basically a mixture of hamburger and rice and tomato sauce wrapped in a cabbage leaf and with a little bit of tomato sauce over it.
So, Allyn, then is that a German from Russia dish?
Yes, very much so. Although, like I say, it probably had its origins as a Ukrainian or Czechoslovakian dish. But definitely very much part of our culture, and I ate that a lot. And then, of course, there were a lot of just dough-related dishes like, strudels. And in the Black Sea culinary tradition, there was something in German they were called Fleischkuechla, which were little dough pockets stuffed with a meat, and they were deep fat fried. And the Volga Germans tended to have a similar thing that were called runzas, but they were more commonly baked rather than deep fat fried. So there were those, and we often had chicken and dumplings. My mother would make some chicken in a pot and then pack dumplings in and steam that all for a noon meal. And then there were, a lot of baked goods were typical that I'm sure every culture had that bread, that bread, I'll call it bread spread. It wasn't just bread. My mother had this creative idea where, she would buy flour in 50-pound bags, and she would mix up a batch of dough, and she was a master chef at determining, okay, it's a little too sticky, more flour, or it's a little too dry, more water. And she had a tradition. Every time she cooked potatoes, she would save the potato water in the refrigerator, and that went in the dough. And inevitably, there would be maybe half a dozen loaves of bread baked every week, but then there were some extras for things like caramel rolls or what we called Kuchen, which is very different from what the Germans in Germany call Kuchen. Ours was that dough with a custardy filling and sometimes a glazed top. And it could be anything from rhubarb to strawberry to cottage cheese to peach, prune, you name it. The filling was wonderful. And those were all, German from Russia comfort food, I will call it.
Do you know the different? What was the Kuchen of the Germans like then versus Germans?
That was more of a cake thing. Okay, if you think of just like a chocolate cake or the kind of things I see on your website that Miss Ninny cooks up as. wonderful, wonderful creations that I would like to eat. So
Yeah.
that would be more the German Kuchen. Yeah.
Okay. And how about pickles and sauerkraut? Where we go with that?
Absolutely. There was always a competition between my grandma bros and the daughters and daughters-in-law about, and a discussion about who made the best pickles. But, we used to grow, a huge pickle patch, a huge cucumber patch in the garden. And we would bring in, 5-gallon pails full of pickles, and we grew dill. And my mother would then, she had her mason jars all lined up, and we would make pickles and not just pickles, but as we talked about earlier, pickled watermelon. The pickles in the jar didn't just have pickles. There were usually spears of carrots in those jars. And what I liked and the rest of the family was astounded by when I ate them was there were little cloves of garlic in there that were pickled. And so there was, pickling was a big thing. Canning of any kind was really part of my mother's strong suit. I don't know how far back that carried. I don't know what was available in pioneer days in the way of things like canning jars and, the big copper boilers you would need to boil all of that up. But certainly in my mother's day, it was a common practice. My uncle ran the grocery store in town. She would buy 14-pound flats of peaches and apricots and cherries, and they all got canned. We had our own native cherry trees growing that my grandfather had planted. So we had, cherry jelly, and she made all kinds of other jelly from apples and grapes and things. So of course, we had a huge garden with, we dug potatoes every fall. It was very much a self-sustaining kind of lifestyle in many ways.
So, Allyn, on the farm, then, as you were growing up, were your responsibilities more outdoors, or did you help your mom in the house with canning?
I was one brother with 3 sisters, and so I got caught betwixt and between. I had a lot more outdoor responsibilities, but that did not excuse me from indoor responsibilities. Because, growing up, we didn't have a dishwasher, so I was one of the wipers of dishes when we had meals, and I had to take my turn sweeping the kitchen floor. But there were other interesting opportunities, and I had the actual opportunity. I would sit with my sisters and my mother, and we would embroider tea towels and pillowcases and things like that. I never learned to crochet. That was usually my grandmother's grand task. We would take the pillowcases to her, and she would crochet the fringes around the pillowcase. And eventually, as grandchildren, we each got a set of those. And those were the kind of things. And of course, the other thing I remember is that my mother would make homemade noodles. And when those and again, there was no pasta machine. It was all by hand, cutting the dough into strips. And then the dining room became the drying room with strings strung across the dining room, and we would be hanging the noodles to dry. And so, I was both indoors and outdoors for that. A lot of the outdoor activities were things like feeding the animals, gathering the eggs, and that sort of thing.
Did your mom ever pickle eggs?
No.
Okay.
Never did.
Okay.
No.
Well, let's talk about sauerkraut. Coming up, a big event in our lives.
100th anniversary
Mhm.
of a sauerkraut festival.
Yeah, we had one of those big cabbage cutters where you'd put the head of cabbage in there and you'd slide it back and forth, and then we had a stone crock, so it all went in the stone crock, and I don't know exactly what kind of seasonings were put into it, but eventually then there was a round cover that fit inside the crock, and there was a heavy field stone that was put on top of that cover, and you just set it away in the basement, and then weeks or months later you had sauerkraut.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That was basically the process.
I know there's something called Bavarian sauerkraut too. Is it just, do you know much about that? And is the difference in what culture would have made that or eaten that just because of the location of in the country in which they lived?
I really don't know. I mean, what I told you about sauerkraut is probably everything I know about sauerkraut in our family, aside from the eating of it, which was
Yes.
delicious.
Do you have a favorite way to eat sauerkraut?
With other foods?
I don't have any favorite. I eat sauerkraut however it comes to me. If it's on top of a half smoke, if it's on top of a pork chop, if it just happens to be straight out of the bottle, we have good gourmet sources for German foods here, so
Nice.
I'm always looking for the sauerkraut produced in Germany because, in my humble opinion, it's better than anything that's produced in America.
We ate sauerkraut with pork chops.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten that. I guess I'm only used to eating sauerkraut on hot dogs or on pizza. Oh, I love sauerkraut on pizza.
I never had it on pizza. That's another new one for me. I'll have to listen to it.
You have to squash out a lot of the liquid though.
Mhm.
And then so it's dry enough to place it. But Canadian bacon and sauerkraut, that's pretty good together.
So what are some unique German customs that we can see in our society still?
Well, when I saw that question, I was thinking about that. And the one thing I came up with, which I think is pretty unique and has roots back to Russia, is the fact that when my great-grandmother died in 1917 at the age of 51 because of the inflammation of the tonsils, which was not treated with antibiotics, there was, on the day of the funeral, first of all, I would say the body was prepared for burial in the home. There was no going into town to the funeral home. The undertaker came out and did everything that needed to be done. But on the day of the funeral, the casket was set in the front yard on chairs, and the entire family gathered around the casket and took the family photograph. And one of my cousins, who interestingly spells his name with the T rather than the Z, a third cousin of mine who lives in British Columbia, his father was born in our ancestral village in 1927 and then came over in 1929. And that family has a picture of my great-grandfather's older brother who died over there. And they have a picture, a very similar picture of him in his casket in front of the house, and a much larger collection of family. So those funeral photographs, I think, are very much part of the German-Russian tradition. I've never heard of American families doing anything quite like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the other thing that I think about that I think was very much brought over from Russia was in the religious tradition, the men had something called the brotherhood. It would translate into English. And they were very pious. They would sit around on Sunday afternoons and have these brotherhood meetings when there was a lot of talking, Bible reading, praying. It would go on for hours. And I have one little oral history note from one of my dad's older cousins who attended some of those. And he said, it went on forever and I couldn't wait to get out of it. He said they were, there were maybe half a dozen men sitting there, and one man would offer a prayer, and then the next man would tag on to that and offer a prayer, and then somebody would read from the Bible. But there's a whole literature on the brotherhood movement within the church.
So what did the women do then while this was ongoing? Did they gather as well?
They did the dishes.
I don't know. I don't have good information on if there was a female counterpart to that at all. I know certainly once they came to this country, they had the Ladies' Aid or the Women's Guild or whatever that was called in the different churches. I have pictures of my grandmother being in the Ladies' Aid group in the German Congregational Church. And, they were always responsible for things like hosting suppers in the fall to raise funds, or another tradition that I don't know, this was particularly German from Russia, but our church always every year had a mission festival. And in my childhood days, that was literally an all-day affair. You would come for morning services on Sunday, and then everybody brought food. It was kind of potluck. And so there was a noon meal in the church basement, and then there was an afternoon service, and then everybody, farm community, everybody went home and did their farm chores, came back in, ate supper at home, came back in the evening for an evening service. And inevitably, at least some of those sermons, if not the entire service, would be in German. And in fact, I was brought up in the evangelical and Reformed church. And up until about 1962, our church had one German service every month. And that meant everything was in German: the preaching, the praying, the singing, and often the after service conversation on the front lawn of the church. And so when, on Christmas Eve, the tradition was that the children in Sunday schools conducted kind of a pageant type service. And we all had songs to sing, and we all had little verses to speak that we memorized. And inevitably, some of those were in German. I mean, we all learned to sing Silent Night in German as Stille Nacht. And, some of us had little German verses to speak. So that tradition clearly carried over.
Okay. Well, Allyn, you've also retraced your heritage, going back, your Germans from Russia heritage, traveling by ship back home, I'm going to call it. Can you tell us a little bit about that? In the closing,
that was sort of the first one was sort of interesting, and I didn't, again, I didn't know it at the time because I didn't have enough information at my fingertips. But after my undergraduate college education, at the end of that time, I had applied for a Fulbright grant to study in Germany. And so I was awarded a grant, and this was 1970. And so rather than flying people over there were about, I believe, something like 400 students who had some kind of a Fulbright grant to Germany. Some of them, like me, were just a study grant. Some had research grants. Some were PhD students working on their doctoral research. Anyway, the Fulbright Commission chartered rooms on a German ocean liner. And so we left New York and we sailed, stopping at Cherbourg in France and Southampton in England, and then up the English Channel. And we disembarked at Bremen in Germany. And so what I found out later was that indeed my Bro's ancestors had left Russia and traveled by train to Bremen, and they boarded a ship in Bremen and spent 2 weeks on the ocean and arrived in New York in November of 1878, and they went through immigration at Castle Garden because Ellis Island was not yet open. It was not yet an immigration site. So I had done, in fact, the reverse journey. And then on my mother's side, I knew, what their route was, and they had a little bit different but similar routes. They came from Russia, and they came to Hamburg in Germany instead of Bremen. And they took what was called a channel steamer, and they took that from Hamburg down through the North Sea and landed at the port of Leith, which is the port for Edinburgh in Scotland. And they rode the train across Scotland to Glasgow, and they left on an ocean liner from Glasgow for New York.
Oh.
My wife is English, and so in 2005, one of our nephews in England was getting married, and we said to each other, neither of us had been to Scotland, so we spent a week in Edinburgh, and I did the little part of the journey where we visited the port of Leith and then rode the train to Glasgow and inspected the port at Glasgow. So
Cool.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
So
I
I
do.
have a little bit of an appreciation for what some of that journey was like.
Yes. I would like you to explain to our viewers the pronunciation of your last name and how we've heard it, or the different ways that it could have been pronounced in this country.
Okay, well, I'll start out by mentioning that, I've looked at a lot of church records in my research over the years. I've looked at church records in Russia, in the United States, and back in Germany in Württemberg. And invariably, for the direct line that I look at, most of the time, the name is spelled Brosz. And in fact, when that happens in Germany, in German records, the name really was spelled Bross, but the Germans call that a hard S. And so when they write it, they use a special character on the German keyboard that doesn't really exist in English. And it looks for all the world like the Greek letter beta. And the Germans pronounce that SZ, which is SZ. So when that gets transliterated into English, BROSZ is the transliteration. But when people talked in the dialect, our ancestors didn't talk High German. They understood High German, but their daily, everyday vernacular was a dialect called Schwäbisch or Swabian. And in that dialect, and I heard this spoken in my hometown in my childhood, the people who wrote their name with an SZ ending often were called or themselves used the word Brost with a T when they were talking. I don't know why that change took place, but it was very common. And so as a result, there are some ancestors who who are part of the same family tree who spell the name SZ. And there are some like your grandmother who spell it ST. And, it's all one big happy family. So
Yes.
the thing I would say about that is when people say, oh, our name isn't quite spelled like yours, we can't be related, be careful about that, because that's not true.
Mhm.
Up until about 100 years ago, in fact, even in written records, you'll find sometimes in the same entry in the church books, the name is spelled two different ways in a baptismal entry.
Yes.
Well, viewers, if you haven't learned about this wonderful history of Germans from Russia, now you know a little bit about it, and you have the opportunity to keep replaying this 1950s Fun Chat to get that information in your mind. And
Yes.
because of our Germans, Jackie's and my Germans from Russia heritage, at least, and of course Allyn is of that same heritage, Jackie and I, will be in Wishick, North Dakota, a week from today, which will be Friday and Saturday, the 10th and 11th of October, for the 100th anniversary of the Wishick Sauerkraut Days. So we anticipate being able to eat many of those wonderful German foods that Allyn described.
Mhm.
And we hope to meet many of you there. That would be wonderful. So, Jackie, how can you close our program?
Well, thank you, Allyn. It's been very enlightening and brought back many memories for Janine and me. And so, viewers, thanks for checking us out. And do tell your friends and even your relatives about this 1950s Fun Chat. So, till next week, toodaloo.
Bye-bye.